One of the most distinct and divisive parts about Marathon has been its art style. It's been described as graphic realism, and the vision holder behind all of this is Joseph Cross. Now, Cross is formerly the franchise art director for Marathon. He also worked on a lot of the original concept art for Destiny, along with other concept art for several movies such as Dune and Ghost in the Shell. Now, recently, an interview of Joe Cross was released by Mikhail Klimentov, hope I pronounced that right. This, though, went over a ton of things such as what Cross's responsibilities were as the franchise art director on Marathon, his vision for the art direction, his thoughts on the game, thoughts on people actually comparing Marathon to Concord, and then ultimately why he really left the team and Bungie. Now, this video is more so going to be a recap of what I thought were the most interesting topics of this interview. A link to the full interview will be linked in the description below, which I highly recommend reading. Again, this was mostly from the art side of things, but there was some insight into the early days working on the project, how things changed over time, and then overall an interesting look into the mind of Joe Cross. So let's dig in. Now, early on in this interview, Joe was asked what his role was at Bungie and what his job actually entailed on a day-to-day basis. As mentioned, Joe is of course the franchise art director, which is a role he held for about 4 to 5 years, he said. He also mentioned though when he was first brought on, he was just art director and was about the 10th or 12th person on that team. He went on to say that at Bungie there are multiple art directors on multiple projects, each one having their own strengths and qualities. Joe said he indexed very highly on vision, which is very much about art and design and detail and taste, and then less so about production and actual asset creation. In terms of his day-to-day tasks, they varied greatly over the span of the 6 years he spent on Marathon. Some examples he gave were really getting into the weeds of designing style guides, paint overs and reference gathering, working with the senior leadership team, working with individual artists, and managing the team, as well as working on ways to communicate your vision and build confidence in the project. Joe was then asked what the process looked like in terms of selling your vision to senior leadership. Now, Cross explained how this was the first time in this role, and he gave a metaphor from The Hobbit where Sam said, "If I take one more step, it will be the farthest away from home I've ever been." And he said that's how he felt every day. He went on to say that within a year they had pivoted from a slightly more realistic style to a more stylized style. He said this style was a risk, but it was something that clicked for him right away. Now, his instinctive way of approaching the challenge that this art style presented was to approach it like production art and like they were doing product design. Now, Joe went on to say that he felt there was a big asterisk for him personally with the kind of art director he was. Bungie knew that he was a vision holder and he wasn't going to come in and just do something generic or basic. He said this came with risk though, as he felt there was a certain amount of slack cut out to him because of who he was and the impact he had on Destiny. I think my biggest takeaway from all of this is the fact that Marathon was planned to have a more realistic art style. It does make me wonder what the game could have possibly looked like. Perhaps it could have looked too similar to Destiny, which is a concern that Joe brings up later on in this interview. Personally, I am a really big fan of Marathon's art style, but I do understand the critiques against it. I think at the end of the day though, it is more important to make a product that you believe in, which is clearly what Joe did here. Okay, next question. Joe was asked, it sounds like a big part of your pitch was the inherent risk of the design. Was making that pitch easy or difficult? Cross said that in a way it was easy for him because he believed in it so much and still does believe in it today, and he felt that if they could pull this off that they would really be on the right side of history. For him, the best case scenario was that the art style becomes a big hit and it helps usher in a new sort of a stylistic aesthetic in the industry. And then the worst case scenario for him was it becomes a cult classic that people who are interested in appreciate. Now, he said the difficult part though was fostering a consensus that this was in fact a good idea, although he did mention that he felt he had angels on his shoulders within the studio that really believed in him and actually stood up for him and vouched for him. Now, the part of his answer that was really interesting to me personally was that he felt at a certain point the art had potentially even more of a responsibility for creating interest in the game. He said for the game design, which is of course an extraction shooter, that no one is really reinventing the wheel here. The narrative also wasn't reinventing the wheel with it being a sci-fi story. For him, it was all about how you spin it, and at some point he told himself that this was an opportunity for the art to really step up and provide a level of newness to the world. Overall, I think Joe brings up a solid point here. Even though the art style is divisive, it is something that is creating interest in the game and it is making people talk about it. And for me personally, it does feel new. I can't really think of many shooters on the market that look like this. I know people bring up all the time the Concord comparisons, and as one of the 6 people that actually played the game, I personally do not see it. Next up in the interview, Joe's asked about the game itself and when the actual stuff you play in Marathon entered the equation, and then how that changed his work when it finally did. Joe started off by saying that right away the game made a lot of sense to him. He loved the bashing of an extraction shooter, sort of battle royale style with cinematics, as well as the tense experience that brings. He also said that he liked the idea of merging all of that with sci-fi and an abandoned colony with what Marathon was doing. He also mentioned that he liked what Arc Raiders has done as well, and that he really believed in this formula. Now, in what Joe described as perhaps the controversial side of things, he was worried about the risk of translating that visual direction that they had designed on paper into the Tiger engine itself, and then the game just ending up feeling like a first cousin to Destiny. Because of this, he made a pretty quick decision to pivot away into something he was sure would not look like Destiny at all. And I believe here he's referring to that more realistic style that they had planned on doing originally. Now, another pretty interesting thing he said right after this is that there was another big moment, which was the game design itself having a pretty profound evolution midway through development. Cross explained that the visual psychology went from being pretty modular in terms of character fantasy, where you are a runner, a modular cyborg, one of 100 or one of 1,000, and then this changed to a psychology where you're now designing a capital C character with a backstory, a name, and everything that comes with it. And then going back to that original question about art relating to gameplay and at what point those worlds collide, he said this was a big one. And in the case of production, this was a very significant event that had to happen incredibly quickly. Now, in terms of the game development having a profound evolution midway through, I believe this has to be referencing the change in game directors when Christopher Barrett was out and then Joe Ziegler came in. Barrett actually posted a thread on Twitter somewhat recently going over some of his original design goals, and one of the things he mentioned was, every player is a unique runner. You decide how you look, what shell to equip, and how you play. No heroes. Joe Ziegler then of course took over, and his background was with Valorant, a more hero-based approach to a tactical shooter. And then if we go back to a previous point Cross mentioned where he said he essentially had angels on his shoulders, it's possible one of those people was Christopher Barrett. He himself was a former art director before he became a game director at Bungie, and I imagine they would have worked pretty closely with each other on Destiny. As well, I'm assuming Barrett was likely one of the people that actually brought Joe Cross onto the Marathon project. However, I could also see Joe Ziegler as one of those angels he mentioned as well, and that's really no surprise to me because if you look at the art direction, I could see Joe Ziegler liking that, as Valorant also had a very distinct look compared to other games in that market like Counter-Strike. So either way, it seemed like Joe had some pretty good like-minded people around him. Next up in the interview, Joe was asked about the beginning of a project and what those first few weeks and months looked like. He said there was really no formula here. They created things like art bibles, style guides, started to lock in and define how you make content. A big thing for him was, why does stuff look the way it does? He then went on to mention a quote that one of his mentors at Bungie said when they were talking about cosmetics. What are they doing different, or what are they doing better? And then that they should really be doing one of those two things at all times. Joe then got a follow-up question asking for some examples of things from Marathon that he remembered being either different or better than something that already existed. Cross said that the weapons were a good example. He said that they tried to land in this spot with weapon design that had different combinations of industrial design qualities. He said that they're simplified, they're modular. They then also went this other way with color and graphic design that is more of a playful space, which can feel a little counterintuitive for a weapon. Now, he did bring up the comparisons to Lego and Roblox, which he said he didn't necessarily think was a bad thing. He actually had IKEA in the style guide because of their incredibly well-designed, functional modular furniture. Now, for something that he does feel like they did better is the character design for Glitch/Vandal. Joe personally loves her footwear and says that he is a sneakerhead himself, and that he would hold up the design of those shoes to any other game's sneaker design or footwear and say that they are legitimately a compelling design. He said he believes in this so much so that he thinks that even a Nike senior designer would appreciate those designs. He then finished off this question by saying that the art style is for the interested, and that none of this stuff should in any way detract from the gameplay experience just because it is a polarizing design. I think Joe brings up a really good point here because at the end of the day, he's just an art director. He doesn't develop the game, he's not an engineer, he's not a programmer. As I've said before, I personally am someone that likes the direction that they took the art style for Marathon, but at the end of the day, for most players, they just want to know if this will be a good game. It needs to be fun, it needs to be engaging, it needs to have a proper endgame, as well as proper support throughout the rest of the year. Yes, the art is important, but to the casual gamer, it is not as important as how fun the game actually is. Now, I have a lot more thoughts on this topic and what Marathon is actually doing to set itself up for success, so if you'd be interested in seeing that video, let me know. Now finally, this led to the question, why did Joseph Cross leave Bungie? Now, I'm going to read this pretty much word for word from the article because this is his own personal reasons and I do not want to misinterpret anything he says. So from Cross, he says, "It ended up being a confluence of things. It wasn't one thing. I worked on this project for 6 years. I still consider myself essentially a commercial artist, and I have an identity as an artist and as an individual. And understanding game development culture, at some point I understood how I relate to all of this. You know, I'm not a founder of Bungie, this is not my company, and I'm conscious of the number of projects I get to work on in my life. I'm not getting any younger. I've spent what will ultimately be 15 years essentially on 2 projects for Bungie, Destiny and Marathon, with some film work in between. So after 6 years, leaving a week or 2 before release lock, I felt an incredible amount of satisfaction in what we'd done. And the natural cadence of the kind of work that happens post-launch in a live service game, I also understood what that was looking like. It's also true that at the level of seniority I had, there are challenges there that don't necessarily exist as an artist. And getting to this phase of a project like this at that level had its own challenges that contributed also. But I'd say primarily it was just feeling like that's a good amount of time to work on a thing. I talked to a lot of artists and peers about it, and ultimately it comes down to your identity. Who are you as an artist, as a creative? That was a decision that I felt like I needed to make. And also, there's definitely a compulsive component to it. It's never easy making a decision to leave a project like this. I second guess myself all the time. I'm not some sort of guru type when it comes to stuff like this. Now, pretty much the final question of his interview was about how there seemed to be this span of time where the conversation around Marathon was the question of, will this fail? Is this like Concord in some way? Joe here explained how all that stuff kind of hits everyone differently. They had both spells where there was a lot of positivity, and then also where there was a lot of negativity. Personally, he was able to compartmentalize a lot of that, with a big reason being his own identity as an artist, with that really being the most important thing to him. He said that it's really difficult for him to take any of that stuff personally because he believes in what they've done. He can only really control what he can control, and he feels really good about that. Now, this next part is something that's kind of been taken out of context, and you may have seen different headlines about this online, so again, I want to read this paragraph directly. Something that sort of weighed on me, not super heavily, but something I've been aware of. You mentioned Concord. Marathon is such a massive project. The studio took such a risk on this. You know, oftentimes we felt like we were sort of getting away with something. And I think about that in the big picture. The idea of studios funding unproven, unknown projects for 6 or 8 years, for hundreds of millions of dollars sort of on spec. How much longer are things like this going to exist? I've been a part of a couple of them now. Joven went on to be asked a follow-up question about how often he was thinking about that. Was this something he was very nervous about, or was it just a background thought? He said probably a combination of things, and that it is really easy to lose sight that you're being bankrolled by someone. You are making a product with a ticking clock that needs to launch into the world and make profound amount of money. He said once you get year 4 to 5 in, it's really easy to feel like your sole job is to make pre-production or production content for a small team. And the profundity of releasing this stuff into the wild can be a mindfuck. He went on to say that it's not always intuitive to remember that this is a product that's being funded, and every day that goes by is a day you're getting further into the red. You're not making money. He said that this is a big one, especially when trying to channel creativity and get to the point where you feel you can't impose anything that feels like a risk. He then finished off by saying that this is where you have to put on the armor of art and really have faith in your perspective and experience as an artist. All great art, commercial anyways, is doubted, and there's a level of skepticism until there's not. Okay, so I have a few closing thoughts here. First is regarding why Cross left Bungie. I know there was a lot of speculation at the time, with people bringing up the art theft scandal again, which, just to be clear, the artist confirmed that the Marathon art issue has been resolved with Bungie and Sony to their satisfaction. So going back to what Cross said, it really did just seem like it was time for him to move on. He said he indexed highly on vision and he comes from the concept art field, so that is what he enjoys doing. With Marathon getting ready for launch, he really would have had very limited opportunities to hone into all of that. As well, we don't really know of any Bungie games that are in early stages of development that could use someone like Joe Cross. All we have right now are some potential rumors of the Destiny 3, which I don't believe have even been proven to be accurate yet. Now, at the same time, he also mentioned how he'd been essentially working at Bungie for about 15 years across just 2 projects. So ultimately, he may have just felt like it was time for him to move on. Now, I also want to touch on the part where Joe talks about the idea of funding unproven projects and how much longer things like this will continue to exist. Now, the reason I wanted to read that in full is because I have seen people online trying to clickbait that and say that Marathon is part of a dying breed, and that is not what Joe is trying to say at all. However, the idea of funding unproven projects is a valid point. If we look at this generation of games, there really hasn't been a lot of risk being taken in terms of AAA studios. 2 of the biggest games as of late, which are brand new IPs, were Expedition 33 and Arc Raiders, which came from relatively unknown studios. Now, yeah, you could argue semantics there of Arc Raiders and Embark, but ultimately their other game, The Finals, was a lot smaller than what Arc Raiders ended up being. And then looking over at consoles like Xbox, a lot of our releases have been mainly sequels in established franchises, besides maybe Starfield, but I mean, that was also a Bethesda game. And then same thing over at PlayStation, lots of established franchises, with some exceptions, I guess, being things like Astrobot, maybe Ghost of Tsushima and Yote, and then Concord, which, I mean, was the complete opposite of a success. So that was my breakdown of this interview with Joe Cross. I personally thought this was very interesting as someone who is a big fan of the game, a big fan of the art, and I like to learn insights into game development. Again, if you want to read his full thoughts, the article will be linked in the description below. If you enjoyed the video though, a like would be greatly appreciated, and if you're interested in future Marathon coverage and content, a subscription would help a lot as I'm trying to grow my channel. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.